and then of course Hmong people were also purposely resettled all over the country, right, so that they wouldn't have
and just
large
certain
communities,
and
right?
just certain regions too.
So we were actually resettled all over the U.S., right?
Mhm.
People were resettled in New York and Georgia and Missouri, and it's
Right.
all over. So and the purpose was to destroy our communities.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Social Exchange Project. This is your host, Pheng Waldinger. Today I have a co-host with me, returning back as Kelly Lohr.
Hi.
And I am just so excited to have our guest today. He is a university professor here at the UW of Eau Claire. He teaches LGBTQ, women and gender sexuality, and Hmong critical studies. So do you want to say hi and introduce yourself?
Yes. Hello. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm super excited to be here. And
Your name is Dr. Kong Peng Pa, but we're trying to figure out how to say it otherwise. It's Dr. Kong Peng Pa.
yes,
Okay.
well, that would be the formal title.
Formal.
But
It's professor to me, but
to make things easier, we'll just go by Kong for this episode.
Okay, Kong. All right.
Yeah, so definitely feel free to just call me Kong. And like I said, I was telling my students, if you know me or if you've taken a class from me, then we could totally be casual. Just call me Kong.
Now, Kao is a student, or
I took a intersectionality class with Professor Pa this past semester. So it's going to be weird to transition and say Kong for this episode.
So I learned about you obviously through my sister, and one of the things that, because we were in a conversation, I think we were at your house, and we were talking about like the podcast that I'm wanting to create, because at that point we hadn't filmed a single one, and I was thinking of all these concepts that were really important to me, and one of them that resonated the most was the differences in identity. So the intersectionality I'm super interested in, because me being Hmong too, that is a huge part of my identity. So like understanding and knowing more about the different facets of people's identity was super interesting to me. So when my sister had mentioned you, I'm like, we need to have him on the podcast. So like, can you just give us, I know you could probably teach about this for obviously forever.
A whole class.
Yeah, a whole class, a whole semester of it, you guys. But what is the premise of that class, and why is it important?
Well, the term intersectionality is a very central concept in the humanities, in all of the disciplines in the humanities, I would say, but especially central and important to feminist studies, women's gender and sexuality studies, right? It was coined by
Kimberly
scholars.
Crenshaw,
Working in feminist studies, Kimberly Crenshaw. So it's just so important, right? To use it to study social problems and to study contemporary social movements, to study identity, right? And so I'm really trying to bring that concept and that term and those theories and frameworks and that body of literature to critical Hmong studies as well, right? Because we also need it there, right? So that concept to me is so useful to just talk about the world, right? And just a little bit about what that is. What scholars are saying intersectionality is that it's this framework or concept we use to talk about the way the world works. So how do you look at the world through different kinds of lens, right? And how do all of these different lenses make up or offer solutions to a particular social problem? So, for example, we can look at racism and see that affects the world and affects our daily lives in a different way. And then, of course, we can't just stop there.
Right.
We have to shift our focus or pivot the analysis and look at how sexism works, right? And how does that
And
inform
Gender and
Gender,
class
exactly.
and
Class.
ethnicity and all that
All of
stuff.
Socioeconomic
these.
status, age
and immigration status. Now
Sure.
there's so much talk around immigration
It's so
in our country.
complex, though.
It
Right.
is,
be
and
hard
that's
to,
something that
break
we
it
talk about in
down.
class all the time is
Yeah.
how all these things are all interconnected and interlocked, and you can't examine one aspect without looking at all the other ones. Because a lot of
Exactly.
times when we
They're
think
really
about,
codependent on one another.
right, because a lot of times when we talk about racism, obviously in terms of skin color, but our race, we're not just defined by our race. Like, for instance, I am defined by my race and my gender and my economic status. And if we're only looking at the issues of race and how that holds me back, we're not addressing all the other stuff that affect it as well. And that's what intersection really wants us to focus on, is like how all these facets of our
it's
identity
meant to be that complex. Yeah, it's very individualized.
Right, it is, and that's why like it's really hard. Even in class, like students ask all the time, like my classmates ask all the time, like, well, then how do we combat this issue?
Right.
And it's really hard because it is really complex.
How do you save the world?
Right.
How do you change the world?
Because we all have different experiences. Like, yes, like we both can say we're both, Hmong Asian American women, but our experiences are very different, even though we share similar identities.
Yeah.
And grew up in the same household with the same parents.
Right. But our experiences are still different, and that still affects us in like individually, like separately. And so what Pheng experiences is going to be very different from what Kali experiences, even though we share very, very similar identities. And that's what intersectionality wants us to look at, is not just the identities, but like the experiences that we experience because of these identities.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great comprehensive explanation of what intersectionality is. And so, yeah, exactly. And so how do we address these problems, right, using multiple lenses? And actually, when I am in class and students ask, oh, what can we do, right, it just seems sort of demoralizing. But actually, for me, the more questions I get to ask and the more I get to just stop and listen, right, to what people have to say, the more clarity I actually get, right? So there is a sense that, like, wow, all of these problems are so complex, they seem like they can never be solved.
Right.
On the one hand, I also feel like, wow, I'm getting so much new information, so much new ways to look at the world. I actually see all these different problems in a new light, right? And that I can approach them in different ways. And so it's sort of both, right, at the same time. But in our class, of course, we ask a lot of questions.
Yeah.
And they become really deep.
I mean,
right?
I think the class is designed to get students to ask questions, because,
Exactly.
I mean, how do you address an issue if a question hasn't been formed? Like, you can't have an answer if has been no question asked.
Yeah.
So it's meant to be not discouraging, but empowering.
Oh, of course.
Because you better understand yourself, so that you're just always cognizant and aware as you go about your life and the decisions that you choose to make, and maybe the social movements that you want to be a part of, or maybe the ones you don't want to be a part of, that you just become more empowered and more individualized in your decision making.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, also, how are you situated, right, within the larger history of your own communities, right, Hmong people living in the United States, but also your larger national communities, right? How are you situated in the United States?
So we're looking geographically and also
of course, time.
Wow,
Yeah.
that does get really complex.
It
That's
does.
actually super interesting, though. I don't think people actually take that into consideration, because it's the generation and the time that you were born in, your race, your gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status.
All of that stuff.
It's a lot.
Yeah, it is. And so how does that relate with what I'm doing in Critical Hmong Studies is, of course, I'm studying youth, right? Hmong American youth. And when we think about youth, we think about identities that are different from, say, the first generation refugees that were the first to be resettled in the 1970s, right? That youth nowadays have very pluralized identities, right? All their identities are sort of all over the place, right? Youth are coming out as queer, right? Many of them are artists, right? We also have Hmong communities, a few sectors who are, of course, very upwardly mobile now, right? Whereas there are others that are not upwardly mobile, right? They're still living in poverty. And so there's so much different intersectionalities, as we would say, right? In how we can go about studying Hmong people, right? And Hmong people's
And that's just
identities.
within the context of Hmong people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like,
Only
there's so
Hmong.
many and that's actually another thing that was the other thing I was really intrigued by is what normally when I think of our history, like the Hmong people and things, I think about obviously the war and how we resettled here and immigration refugee status and things like that. But I never once thought that it was like sexual orientation, and it was all the taboo sometimes that comes with it, because we're a relatively conservative like
Community.
our cultural values are somewhat conservative. So I think sometimes, like, I remember us asking our parents about that, and I don't even think that they were educated about any of those things because they were
Yeah.
always in survival mode. They didn't even
Right.
stop to think about all these subcategories that were happening within our own community. And so, I mean,
they think
that's
about like
super-
at that time, like the larger aspect of like what was oppressing them, which was the war.
Right.
And so you don't even
Or
think about all the other
socioeconomic status,
right,
like,
and
or
so you don't
educational
even think about
history.
all the other aspects like that. I mean, for them, it like you said, it's in survival mode. So like you can only focus on like what is at hand right now.
Right.
And I think like when we talk to like our parents about it, like my mom, I know for her, she's very curious about like homosexuality and like all that stuff because obviously she sees that a lot on TV and stuff. My dad was very much like, oh well, that doesn't exist in the Hmong community, like that's never existed in the Hmong community.
Right.
And it's only more so exists now because
and
of
that was
the
very
influence
much
of
just
the
his
environment.
experience. Like, he didn't know anything.
Right.
He just did not know.
Right.
know?
Yeah. So I think it's very interesting, and I think it's really good that like within the Hmong community, there's a voice now for queer queer studies or just to give that kind of voice to the Hmong community.
It's always existed, and I
of
think
course.
that's the thing is that now being more in the mainstream, I guess. And we're always still fighting that battle of like what we're going through too, obviously. But like even in today's world where things can be a little bit more, it's more like human rights now. In the last few years, you've seen it, and it's not just political, but all these huge rushes of like women equality, and then just having rights for legal marriage in the last few years and things like that. That's not even something that in our community, because I think of like the Hmong community and the mainstream as sometimes two different things, but they actually really very much relate. And now I'm seeing in our community there's a lot more of that, like that pride and things like that. Where do you think we are right now?
Well, it's hard to assess, right? But I mean, I would say just in general, we are doing better than what we were 40 years ago, right? When Hmong people first were resettled in the U.S., of course, what we were mainly concerned about was will we survive, right?
Yeah.
We don't have anything, right? We're living in all these impoverished neighborhoods, and in fact, when Hmong people first came to the U.S., we were purposely resettled, right? To in neighborhoods with Black communities, right? And then, of course, Hmong people were also purposely resettled all over the country, right? So that they wouldn't have
And just
large
certain
communities,
and
right?
just certain regions too.
So we were actually resettled all over the U.S., right? People were resettled in New York and Georgia and Missouri, and it's all over. So, and the purpose was to destroy our communities, right? So,
and I think also like probably because weren't there sponsorship programs too? So only certain people could sponsor a certain amount of families. And
I know for
different
us,
areas
I don't know if it's like universal, but I know for us it was a lot of them probably were done through churches and
yeah,
stuff. So.
I mean,
or other
churches.
families who's been here for a while.
Yeah, but
too,
then
or
the
something
thing
like
is
that.
like even if it was through other families, those families were most likely like sponsored over through churches.
Yes.
Sure.
So in some ways, you're always somewhat tied to the church.
Yeah, right. So then, of course, Hmong communities felt like they were beholden, right, to their sponsors, or felt obligated to be forever indebted, right, to their sponsors, and that's not very liberating, right? Like you feel like you're tied to them because they save you,
Right.
And you have,
But that's like also like very like I don't want to say Hmong because it's kind of like a very Asian mentality. Is this like gratitude kind of like mentality that we always have? Is like, and in some ways it's good, and in some ways it's bad. Obviously, it depends on how you always use it. But like this idea that like when someone does something for you, you always want to like repay their kindness. But sometimes that allows for people to be taken advantage of.
Right. Like sometimes Hmong people feel like they don't have the space necessary to make their own decisions, right? That the sponsors are making all the decisions for them, and maybe they might not like it, but don't know how to articulate that they didn't like it, so they just went along with it, right? So
better to be polite sometimes.
Exactly. So Hmong people didn't have a lot of agency in that sense, right? And so of course their main thought was, how am I going to survive poverty, right? Or maybe Hmong people were facing a lot of racism as they were being resettled, so their main thought might be, how do I resist racism, right? And so there was not any opportunities for thinking outside of the box, right? To think about gender equality or queer issues or LGBTQ children, right? So that we didn't have those opportunities, and those identities were not very at the forefront, right, of Hmong people's sort of survival mode in the early years. But I think that since at least the 1990s, Hmong people were gaining access to media, right? They were gaining access to the political arena, right? The first Hmong elected officials, some of them were actually right here from Eau Claire, right? So we
or the cities, which is very nearby.
Yeah, well, the cities, and in fact, the cities is the biggest place for Hmong political organizing, right? So we got access to those domains where we can say, hey, there's gender issues we need to focus on. There's queer issues. There's issues around like refugee resettlement justice and immigration justice, right? That we need to focus on, and we also need to focus not just on Hmong, but how other communities relate to us and how we relate to them, and how can we build community together, right? So media and
find common ground.
Exactly. And media allowed us to do that. The political arena allowed us to do that. Of course, Hmong people were also gaining access to education in the 90s, and then of course in the 2000s, right? We were getting
So we're killing the game right now.
more scholars who are able to have these conversations with people. And so I think that's a good thing. And of course, I don't think LGBTQ issues is still very much in the spotlight, but more so than before.
Okay, so we were talking about terminology and how sometimes there's like a lack of certain issues within the Hmong community that we don't have like terms for.
Right.
And I said like it was really hard to have these conversations or dialogues about these social issues.
Because they're not even formed concepts.
Right, yeah.
They're
And I think
ideas.
sometimes it's hard to address something if you don't have a concrete concept of it already.
Right. And I think that's a big issue and challenge for a lot of queer youth, right? And I've done research and interviewed a few of them, and that is a challenge, right? How do you name yourself, right? And make yourself legible, right? To the rest of the world, right? And language allows us to be visible, right? That I can name who I am, and I can articulate my experience, my identity, and my truths, right, to people, and that's empowering. And we don't have those terminology, right?
I
So
mean,
it's a
because
challenge.
I've seen, because I've heard like some of like my aunts or uncles or like even my parents like use borrowed terms,
right?
But like, and for me, sometimes that can be problematic because borrowed terms can give us a certain concept, but then sometimes it can distort our concepts in those actual
or like they'll
native
borrow like
language.
the English terms of it,
and it doesn't fully capture,
right? Because like for instance, like I know like they use the word katoi, which is a Thai term,
right?
But I know like sometimes in the Thai context, it doesn't necessarily translate correctly,
right?
So we can use it in one way, but then when we were like, oh, well, that's a Thai word, and then it would directly translate to that same meaning in Thai, like then that also becomes problematic because sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, and so that's part of the challenge for a lot of youth is how do I name myself, right, to the world that in a way that's empowering to me. And right now we don't have any. So people ask me like, what do we say?
Right.
And I just say, I don't know. Right. We have to sort of resort to the long-winded explanation of what queer is. And then we have to sort of drop in a few words here and there about what does it mean to desire people of the same gender or sex. But that doesn't necessarily entail like physical intimacy. So it's pretty difficult and complicated, right? But on the one hand, I know that a lot of the queer youth that I've talked to in the past have also found it empowering to not have terminology, right? That when you do have terminology, then it kind of solidifies
the concept, which then it doesn't allow for fluidity.
Exactly, right? So it might trap you, right, in a way, right? To say, okay, well, you're just gay or lesbian,
like you're marginalized, then.
right? Or you're just this one thing,
right? Because then we think about like, and when we use like LGBTQIA plus, like it just keeps getting longer and longer because we're creating these new categories,
right? It becomes another category, right? So to not be categorized, to not be named, to not be stuck in a particular static identity category might also be empowering in its own ways, right? So some youth have sort of taken that direction. Right?
So do you think it's easier? Like if for me, let's say, would it be best for me to think of myself in a very comprehensive, complex sort of forms of identity that come together, you know, as one? Or is it better sometimes to just kind of simplify certain things?
I don't know. It's maybe
I feel like
both,
that's
right?
I feel like it's like
that's
individual.
a question, I guess.
Yeah.
I feel like it's an
sometimes.
individual preference.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like that refers to like even like when it comes to like how people want to be referred to as, like when we're using pronouns,
Right,
like
right.
we're always asking like, what pronoun do you want to be referred to as? And like it's really hard because even for me as someone who is part of like the Women and Gender Studies program,
Right.
like I still find myself hesitating to ask that question because like we're always taught that like it's impolite or it's like maybe not like the best way to approach a situation. But I
think
also
that's what I'm seeing though is
right
like there's it becomes sometimes very complicated, like you said, LGBTQIA plus, because there's all these other
right.
things that these concepts that are now being introduced and reintroduced because they are new definitions and people are still learning and exploring more about themselves. Like, is it sometimes better to just say I'm a person that likes these things, or I'm this person who, like, I guess that's sometimes what I ask.
Yeah.
And that's maybe a little ignorant, but I'm just like, is it sometimes better just to simplify things because I'm just like you, let's find common ground rather than like distortedly have all these concepts of what my identity is and then have you understand all of those things where we can have a connection.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the goal is to arrive at like our common humanity,
Yes.
right? But then part of what intersectionality is trying to do is to say, well, everyone is different and we need to appreciate the differences, right?
Right.
The differences actually are not, or the differences theoretically should not be divisions, right? But in fact, the differences is actually a sign of beauty in the human experience, right?
Yeah.
But then, of course, the way differences worked in history is that it's been used
always been as
to
a
divide.
divide.
Yeah,
Right?
but I think differences should be used to learn
Exactly.
from one another.
Exactly.
rather
That's what we
than-
want to get at, right? Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So
Awesome.
to not just say none of us are different, right? And that we're all the same. So I think that's good, but we're
not really all the same,
We're not really all the same.
Yeah.
And we should appreciate and learn
Yeah.
from the differences, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're okay, I'm gonna switch gears. I did get your
Right,
permission.
definitely.
Right.
Yeah, let's do
So
it.
we're gonna do this where I am going to, because we're friends on Facebook. I'm really proud of that. I'm gonna keep saying that, and I'm gonna
Yeah.
look through your Facebook.
I mean, we're not even friends on Facebook.
I mean, on Facebook.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is what I'm gonna do, and if it's okay with you, I'm gonna go through your Facebook.
Sure.
No pressure. I'm gonna just stalk you on Facebook. I'm gonna go through your Facebook because there's a lot of things that I find super intriguing, and I'm learning a lot through you too.
Oh, right.
This entire show is about learning through the other person's lens.
Yes.
Whether they're the co-host or whether they're a guest of honor, and I want you to speak a little bit more to it because there are things that you shared, and I am familiar with a lot of the stuff that is happening in the world too, through these articles that you're sharing, but it's always nice to get your opinion. So if you're okay with it, I'm going to go through some of the things that I found, and I'm like, I just want to pick your brain a little bit
Sure.
more about. So
I do post a lot about tennis too. I'm a big tennis fan.
about tennis?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know much
So
about tennis.
slide that in there.
Slide-
Yeah. Big tennis fan. Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you shared about, and this was very controversial. I knew about this. It was all over social media.
Yeah.
About the county in Minnesota that banned. It was basically banning refugees or banning the acceptance of refugees because they
Yes.
felt very comfortable where they're at.
Yeah.
I don't know, exactly all the ins and outs. I'm not gonna pretend like I do because maybe they had other reasons that were political, not maybe racially charged. But it seemed in this particular article, and this was from the West Central Tribune,
Right.
that it was very racially charged.
Right.
Can you speak about that? Because you had a lot to say, but
Well, I do because, of course, as you know, I'm a critical refugee studies scholar, right? And I
Exactly.
study Hmong refugee migration to the United States.
and they were refusing refugee settlements
Exactly.
in their
So-
county of in Minnesota.
So for me, it becomes, of course, a very personal issue, like why?
Right.
But then also it becomes a very scholarly, intellectual sort of question, like what is it about refugees that produces this kind of anxiety, right? For predominantly white communities, and this was I think a predominantly white community in Bemidji,
I think they were much older too.
Minnesota, right? And they seem to be
Older
much older
population.
from what the pictures tell us, right? So we can
We can look up the stats though. I'm
Yeah.
sure.
But let's just say these are primarily white counties or communities in rural Minnesota who have these anxieties about newcomers and refugees. And the way that we think about refugees now is that refugees bring social problems, right?
My cow's dying.
Oh no.
Are you okay?
Sorry.
Are you okay?
Anyways, carry on.
I don't know yet if I'm okay, but
Right. And so what people think about refugees is that they bring social problems. But we know from studying Hmong refugees and Vietnamese refugees in the Twin Cities, but also at the country at large, if you think about Vietnamese refugees in different cities, right, they have been able to create businesses that have benefited.
They've accomplished greatly.
They have done so much.
Yes.
And specifically for Hmong.
And that's like stats too. It's not just
stats.
like, oh, these are just the few that, no, they're stats that they are, majority of the time, they're really grateful to be here. And it is a chance to start a life anew.
Yeah.
So they take those opportunities. They really like, so I don't know if you read this, but Tujer Zhang,
Yes.
he's very huge in the Hmong community, but just he's a huge social activist. He's a comedian. I've known him like since I was like a young child.
Yeah.
And he spoke about all of those things,
Right.
like how his entire family they're very successful and they contribute greatly as refugees. I mean, I think that that's probably the greater majority of refugees.
Yeah, and Hmong people for sure in the Twin Cities. We have all these commerce districts. We have the Hmong New Year and the 4th of July Freedom Festival contributes a lot to the social, cultural, and economic development of the Twin Cities.
Absolutely.
There are politicians who are doing great things for the city and the Twin Cities for both cities. So contrary to refugees bringing social problems, actually refugees come and develop and make the city better.
What do you think the problem is, though? Like, what does the opposing side, say about refugees? What are they afraid of? What are the issues that they seem that they feel that they would be facing if somebody was to resettle back in their county?
Well, I think one is primarily economic anxieties, right? Like,
are they going to take our jobs?
Yeah, they're going to take our jobs. Well, we have to take care of them, right?
Like they're going to be on welfare and we're going to pay taxes. Okay.
We'll pay taxes.
social
We're going
like programs that you have.
Yeah, we'll have to devote more money to them to
more
help.
Taxes
and being
we
a
have to
part
pay.
of and I can say this too because then I'm not going to say where I work, but I work for a low income, it's a federal program, which is essentially welfare. It's employment and training. And predominantly it is white women. So it's not refugees or,
Yeah. So, and we know, of course, that refugees aren't the only people that are living in poverty, right? That we have Americans living in poverty. So,
I mean, I think when we think about the welfare program too, it's not many people. Like, there's more white people on welfare than people of color.
There are those statistics out there, and so part of it is economic anxieties. We don't have enough resources to go around to help these people, right? So why can't we just devote those resources to existing communities rather than try to divert them to newcomers, right? We don't even know. So part of it is that, and I would say that that's a wrong sort of way of thinking, right? That I would say that there are enough resources.
So that
to
really
go
hit
around.
home. That was very personal.
Yeah, there are enough resources to go around, and if there isn't, we should find ways to help.
And I think like we see like in other countries where immigration is very limited,
Yeah.
that they have like their economy in a lot of ways have decreased because of it.
Right.
Or like
And
suffered, you're saying?
Yeah, and then for them to be able to rebuild, they have to open up they have to like loosen their immigration laws.
Yeah.
And I guess don't quote me on this, but I thought that
We're going to have to get stats.
I thought that recently South Korea was like that,
Yeah.
because like South Korea has like I thought that before they had a really strict immigration law where it was actually really hard, I think, for an outsider to get like citizenship or anything like that. But recently, with like a lot of foreigners going there to like work and stuff, and then obviously when they work there, they obviously live there and they contribute to the economy. They saw that it actually was very beneficial.
Like it flourished.
Yeah, and so then they loosened their immigration policy, and so now a lot more foreigners are able to get in easier, get jobs, get better jobs, and in this case also live there longer.
Right.
And now their economy is like booming.
Right.
So I'm going to switch then to the next thing. So thank you so much for that, because I could speak to you about that all day also. But
we could talk about it all day.
Oh my gosh, I can. Okay, so the next thing that you also shared this, and this was something huge in our community.
Yes.
So it wasn't just because this person was a very famous Hmong singer, but there was a shooting. It was gang related in California. What do you think about what's happening within our own community with Hmong people killing Hmong people sometimes? And what do you think that is? What's your opinion on that?
Well, I mean, it is a very tragic event for all of us, right? With this shooting, and of course, a very famous Hmong singer was killed. So that was also tragic, and along with other people who were killed, and so.
It was essentially mass shooting.
Yeah, it's a mass shooting. And of course, the CNN called it a milestone.
Which is horrible. I hated that so much. I mean, here's the thing. There's mass shootings that seem to be happening every day. And it's sad because it's becoming like a norm in America. Right. But it obviously always hits a lot closer to home when it's Hmong people, Right. And they categorize this as a milestone, which is absolutely atrocious and embarrassing.
And I'm pretty sure they released speculation that it was gang related before even having any kind of confirmation, which then perpetuates stereotypes again.
And this was in Fresno, I think it was, in California. Yeah. So what are your thoughts on all that too? Because I'm sure we could talk about that all day.
Yeah, I mean, at first I was really sad, right? But then I, of course, became really angry at how the event is being portrayed in the media around it being a milestone, but also, the first sort of framework that people know to use to understand Hmong people is just this gang, right? That any sort of violence is
we're attributed to
implicated, right? In gang violence, which I think to me takes away a lot of focus on mass shootings as an American sort of problem, right? It takes away
cultural norm in some ways
it takes away any kind of conversations that we can have around public policy related to gun safety. Right, it takes away any kind of conversation that we can have around.
It was stripped down to race, gang related,
or interpersonal, right? Yeah. Gang related. That it's just these two gangs. They just want to kill each other, and it's not really relevant to the rest of us or the rest of America.
You feel like it was dismissed a little bit?
Well, right, because Hmong people are more complicated than just that, right? And then of course, it was determined that none of the victims were part of gangs, right? Mm-hmm. That it was a sort of a mistaken shooting, right? So the perpetrators might have been in gangs, but then that it was a mistaken case of identity, and so
it just sells the news that if it was gang related, it was like Hmong or Asian Americans that would But I understand because it's a tragic loss to all the families that had to be a part of that, and in our community too. I mean, my mom was a huge fan of singer. Yeah.
Even Pheng, our cousin,
she I am too. I'm a big fan.
Yeah, I know, and it's just it's really sad.
Yeah, so I think from this event, hopefully we can have a better, more nuanced conversation around gun violence, around safety in our communities, around how do we reduce harm and look out for one another in the Hmong community, right? And I've actually been pretty hopeful because there have been a big shift, right, in how Hmong people respond to gun violence, even in my own families, right? Now I see family members who are like, oh, wow, we need to do something, right? Or this is not right? So now there are minor shifts. And so for me, I would say that's at least a good thing.
That is a good thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so something a little bit less intense. I see for the season 39 of Survivor, we have our very first Hmong queer.
Yes.
He's 27. I was reading his bio and I was fascinated because now I want to watch. I think it's February 12th or something. It's coming up soon. It's going to premiere. What are your thoughts on that? Because that is a huge representation of our people.
Amazing.
It's amazing.
Right? I believe the contestant, his name is Vince
Moore. Yep.
And he will be the first Hmong American contestant on Survivor. But not only is he the first Hmong American contestant, he's also the first Hmong queer contestant. And so that's big, right? Add a little bit of intersectionality into the show.
And he talks a lot about our history too, like
does.
refugee and stuff. Like, I think that's going to be insanely wonderful.
Yeah, he brings in different perspectives. And, this show is about putting random people in random places to see if they will survive, right? Like, it seems kind of colonial to me in a sense, right? White people being dropped in the middle of the Pacific Islands and see if they can get out. And so it is very colonial in a sense.
It is.
So it's the time has come, right, to at least decolonize this show a little bit.
I love your terms for this.
Yeah, I'm an academic, so I pull from different terminology, but I think it is time, right, to decolonize this show a little bit and add a few more diversity, Asian American representation, but of course Hmong American representation.
That's even better.
Yeah, exactly, and to show that not all Asians are the same, right?
Yep.
But that not all Hmong people are the same either, right? Because I know that. Just based on social media, there have been a few Hmong people who didn't like that this person was queer or gay, and so.
Well, I think for a lot of people, it's like I want to be represented, but then now that is going to be the representation among people. But it's like.
But any representation is wonderful because the point is that we're so different.
Right. And this particular representation is particularly groundbreaking, right? Because I don't think that we'll ever have Hmong queer representation at such a level ever again for a very long time. In contrast, we already have Hmong straight representations.
Right.
Right.
Gran Torino, even it's a
more.
horrible movie.
Right,
But we have things there. And so this is just one
At least it's a stepping stone, though,
Right.
because and I don't want to say this because I have talked to Dua more about being on my podcast, so we're gonna X that out. But Gran Torino, it wasn't my favorite movie, and I don't think it was super accurate because obviously it was a gangs again, stealing cars,
It's
and maybe it happens occasionally, and I think I don't know what the setting was, but like in California or something, maybe I don't know. But I don't think it was super representative of like who we are and what we're doing on a day-to-day
it's
level,
representative of us through, in this case, a white male's point of view.
Exactly.
Right.
It was
so it's really one-sided,
Americanized.
and you're not getting the full truth. And so, like, if you really want to delve into what a community is like, you have to ask the community members. And in this case, I don't think Clint Eastwood did that.
But
so.
I was excited, at least what I did take away from that, because even though I didn't particularly enjoy the movie itself, was that it actually had somebody that spoke Hmong for just parts of the scenes. And I'm like, this is a huge Clint Eastwood movie. And there's somebody speaking Hmong, an old grandma speaking Hmong. That's insane. I felt like, even though...
Well, it was nice in the way that it kind of got people to question or ask, who are the Hmong people?
Yeah.
And they looked us up, and they were more, and it got us on the map. So I'm thankful for that, and I can take that. It's not going to always be done perfectly. So
yeah, and the actors, were able to find other opportunities beyond Gran Torino that they probably would not have had were it not before Gran Torino, right? So they were able to find agency and empowerment in other small ways, right? That I think is very significant.
And I think too, another thing is having like Hmong celebrities is something like Brenda Song, I guess it would be Song. She's a Zhang, I guess technically. She's half Hmong. And I never knew that when I was watching Sweet Life on Deck and Sweet Life on Disney. All right. But like, just because she's one of the most successful Hmong actresses, like I empower that because I'm just excited to see somebody, even if a lot of the things that she does is not always going to pertain to our cultural like values and our like heritage and stuff. I still have a lot of pride in that. So cool. All right. Next one. This is weird because this is something you shared in September, and it was actually about you.
Me?
It was your research.
Oh, so I share a lot about my students.
Our Critical Hmong Studies, and it was about researchers who created tools to test hearing in people who speak Hmong. Tell us about your research.
So we actually only did the first part of the research. The second part of the research is going to be done by a team in Madison, so at UW-Madison.
Okay.
But our first part was, so I worked with another student in my seat, and we both basically did like the research of like other past audiology, like kind of like research while they compiled this. So we kind of like tried to figure out which tactics or which strategies would work best for us. So we looked at a whole bunch of other research and then kind of like picked and chose what we thought, like strategies that we thought would work for ours. And then from there, we also had to pick out basically words that were phonemically balanced, which means that in every single list, there was the same amount of sounds and tones and like consonants.
What was your hypothesis?
So there wasn't really like a hypothesis. It was just basically we had to. So for us, we actually compiled all of our words from Hmong like children's books or folk tales because we don't have a lot of children's books to pull from.
Right.
So we did a lot of folk tales and stuff. So we compiled, I believe it was probably like over 8,000 words, which is not a lot to pull from. And then from that, we had to form 50 words in a set of 4 lists. So you're looking at about 200 words. And then but each of these lists had to be phonemically balanced. So like, and then we obviously, to find the phonemic balance, we had to find out within these 8,000 words, which was the sounds that occurred the most. And then once we picked out the sounds that occurred the most, we had to do our list based on
So what
these
did you
sounds.
find?
So I don't have, unfortunately, my data sheet here with me. But
how dare you?
I know, but you didn't tell me you were going to be talking about
this. You should have been back pocketing this.
But yeah, but the thing is that like it's really hard because we in the Hmong language we have a lot of like what we call classifying words, which are words to help emphasize like, you know, like nouns or like pronouns and stuff, but they don't actually have a meaning on their own.
Right.
So that's the other. So we ran into a couple of issues when we were forming these lists, because in a lot of the other researches that we looked at, they had like a pool, like over 100,000, maybe even millions of words to pull from. And ours was 8,000. So like we had a really tiny pool of words to like pull from. So when you're looking at words like lu or like y'all, you know, those things don't have meaning on their own. Right. But like when you attach them to like a noun, it like makes them plural or makes, you know, them, you know, whatever.
Right.
So we actually had to eliminate all those words because those didn't have meanings on their own. So when you're looking at like 8,000 words and you have to eliminate all these classifiers, I think when we came down to it, we had like probably like less than 5,000 words to work with.
Yeah.
And so we didn't have a lot of things to work with. So unfortunately, I think half of our list was phonemically balanced, but the other ones weren't. We just kind of had to pull from other sounds and stuff. But eventually we got the full list together and then we sent them off to Madison and we kind of...
So they're doing the next tier of research.
Yep. So we like did like a whole report on like our research process and how we compiled the list. And then we sent it to them and they're basically going to do the experimental part. So they're going to basically be doing audiology like testing on actual human subjects to see how it works. And then if we have to tweak the lists a little bit, and once it's finalized, then these lists that are compiled would basically be sent out nationally to all audiologists that they would be able to be used with the Hmong community.
Like that wasn't even something I ever thought about. Like, what are your thoughts on all that?
I mean, that's great. I mean, I was super proud of both of my students who are WGSS students, right?
Yeah.
Doing this work and, of course, doing work relevant to helping Hmong communities. And so we need these kind of research to, you know, put Hmong people on the map of scientific research and scientific innovation, right? So that there are communities out there who are unaccounted for when it comes to audiology, when it comes to medicine, when it comes to terminology that will help Hmong people understand, you know, concepts.
It was really interesting for me because when Professor Lindsay Walter approached me about this research, I did it because I thought it would it would be a great opportunity for me to kind of like expand on my linguistic major. But when I started doing it, I obviously the value that I saw in it increased. And then also because like my dad has like he wears hearing aids. Well, he's supposed to. He doesn't actually wear them, but he has them, and I actually
refuses to wear them.
Yeah, I actually went with him when he did his first audiology test, and they couldn't use words with him because it's hard when you don't understand all the words.
Right.
And like within language, like we see that there are certain sounds that sound differently to other people who have a different native tongue.
Right.
And so that's what makes it really hard. And so they actually did like just like the sound where like they do like the beeping, and then he
Right.
just has to tell them like what ear he heard the beeping in.
Yeah.
And like, so I actually was like, wow, like this list could actually help people like my dad who like, you know, don't speak English very well. And then like they have like, in this case, at least 4 different lists to use
Right.
to kind of like confirm whether this person is actually going deaf or if they're just not understanding like the words.
Yeah.
So I'm going to switch gears here a little bit because we're coming down to our last few minutes here. I really am interested because I spoke to you the other day when I called you on the phone.
Right.
And we talked a little bit. I did it like a pre-interview. And you had explained to me that you were writing a book and you've been working on a book for a while.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that before we go today? Because I got that you've been doing a lot of research. You've been picking up on a lot of different articles and things like that. Can you tell us more about what your book will consist of and what the premise of that book is?
Yeah, so this project that I'm working on is a project I've been working on for a long, long time, almost 10 years
Gathering
now. Gathering data, reading literature to understand more about what I'm trying to say, writing, revising. So this book I'm writing is generally, it's about Hmong people's refugee migration and how does that relate to their racial, gender, sexual, and queer formations in the U.S., right? So what does racism or racial justice or queer justice, how does that involve Hmong people and their status as refugees, right? Is sort of the big question I'm trying to ask. And so through that, of course, I'm looking at various different dimensions, right? About
again,
of
it goes
Hmong.
back over to the complexity of all
Exactly.
these different things. Yeah.
Right, so I'm looking at how law, for example, talks about Hmong people's gender and Hmong people's marriages and Hmong people's social relationships and intimacies. I'm also looking at how the media portrays Hmong people and their genders and the way they practice their sexualities and their marriages and their kinship systems, right? And then, of course, I'm also looking at how Hmong Americans themselves are remaking ideas about what it means to be a woman or to be queer or to be in a equitable marriage, right? So how are people both within Hmong communities and outside looking at gender, sexuality, race in different ways, right? And then, of course, that's one part of it. Another part is I've interviewed a few LGBTQ Hmong youth, right? And I'm interested in how they are remaking Hmong culture, right? And specifically what Hmong culture has to say about gender and sexuality, right? What does it mean to be a Hmong person who possess or practice or have a different identity from the rest of the community? And what does that mean for us as Americans, right? Mm-hmm. So this is the second part of the book. And I'm really trying to get this idea that Hmong people are very diverse, mm-hmm. right? That we are very diverse, that we have a lot to say around racial justice, right? That we have a lot to say around what it means to have gender equality in our communities, but also in the world, and to feminism, right? That Hmong people can contribute a lot to feminist theory in the ways that we talk about gender, right? That's different from mainstream white feminist theories. And then, of course, Hmong people and Hmong LGBTQ youth have a lot to say about what it means to be queer. And they have a lot to theorize around queer theory, and they have a lot to say about Hmong people's identities being transformed, right, in the country, and that they are contributing to social justice. Of course, this article that you all read about vernacular activism is part of this research, right, where youth activists are bringing ideas about culture, bringing ideas about race, bringing ideas about Hmong language into the LGBTQ social movement, right, to legalize same-sex marriage, right? So this is one part of it, right, that they are contributing to changing their own communities, but they're also contributing to social justice for the larger America.
And that their contributions are active and genuine.
Exactly. So it's sort of a two-part project that I've been working on, and now I'm going to be interviewing more people, of course. It's never ending. The research is never ending. But I really anticipate that once this project of mine is done, I will be able to publish this book, and people will read it and learn more about just Hmong people, but to learn more about how Hmong have been able to contribute to social justice.
And how we've evolved as people over time.
Yeah, how we have transformed, right? And this is actually the strange part with folks, is that even for Hmong students, right, is that change is not a comfortable thing, right? But in fact, Hmong culture is always changing, right? So
Culture is always changing.
culture is always changing, and so that's also what I'm trying to get at with youth, right? Is that you can be empowered to be different, you can be empowered to change, right? And that your transformation is empowering rather than a limitation for our community, right? Yeah.
Interesting.
So when do you expect this project to be finished?
Well, my personal goal is hopefully no more than the next 5 years, but books take a long time to be written.
do.
So
Absolutely.
we'll see. That will be my goal for myself.
Well,
so.
we're anticipating it, and I'll be
Okay.
following you for a while.
Yes,
Not in a
please
creepy,
do.
stalky way, but I will be following you because I want that book, and
Yeah.
I would love to learn more about you too in the future. So hopefully, do you ever just do classes? Sidebar. Do you ever just do classes for like the general public for just continuing ed credits or anything, or do you have to be a student?
I don't teach those classes currently, but that's something I want to do in the
Does the-
future.
Consider
is
it.
community classes.
Does
right?
the
Yeah.
university allow people to sit in on classes as long, like, obviously I know some universities that I've been with the past, they say like it's up to the discretion of the professor.
Yeah.
But I don't know if
I
Eau
value
Claire's like
education
that,
a lot, and I
so-
would love to be a
Yeah.
part of.
I mean,
one
for
of
me,
yours.
I would love to have community members or non-students be in my classes, because learning is a dynamic
Community
process,
thing,
right?
yeah.
It's a community
Yeah.
sort of process. So let's try to find those opportunities.
All right, I'll
Yeah.
be there. Well, I thank you so much for being here today. I know it's not the prettiest outside, and it's also Packers are playing. It's a Sunday, you guys.
Oh, right.
Packers are playing. So thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing more of what you're doing and how things go with your book.
Yeah,
Thank you for
having
joining us.
me.
Thank you.
Yeah.